Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
If nothing else this year, we've learned one thing. Lawsuits involving Subway sandwiches make headlines. Because it's actually the same people in the same story. But every time they do something, every time they turn around, it makes headlines. So from Reuters, and a bunch of people sent me the story. The lawsuit over Subway tuna now says that chicken, pork, and cattle DNA were detected in the tuna sandwiches. And this is not a separate piece of litigation than what we talked about previously. There was originally a lawsuit filed that said Subway tuna sandwiches don't contain any tuna. That case was filed, the lawsuit was filed, and then I believe the court asked them to amend their complaint. The complaint has been amended now a couple times, and that happens. But when they've amended it, they've now added more information and more allegations. And the most recent allegations, the most recent complaint, state that Subway is deceiving the public about its tuna products because they've now done lab testing that show the animal proteins that are contained in the tuna sandwich were identified as chicken, pork, and cattle, and not the advertised 100% tuna. And when I first reported on the story that said that somebody claims that the tuna sandwiches don't contain any tuna DNA, people asked how many samples did they test? And is it possible that one of the stores was swapping something out? Isn't that possible? Well, they've apparently heard your questions because they've addressed that in this lawsuit. So pay attention. The couple at the center of this suit, two people, filed a third version of their proposed class action this week in federal court in San Francisco, near where they live in Alameda County. Subway said in a statement it will seek to dismiss the lawsuit because it is both reckless and improper. Reckless and improper. The chain says the plaintiffs have now filed 3 meritless complaints, changing their story each time, and its high-quality, wild-caught, 100% tuna was regulated strictly in both the U.S. and around the world. Since the case began in January of this year, Subway has even run TV ads and launched a website dedicated to doing nothing but defending their tuna. They've also revamped their menu, and the only thing they did not revamp was the tuna description because they said that did not need to be upgraded. That was correct as written. The original lawsuit claimed that Subway tuna salads, tuna sandwiches, and tuna wraps were bereft of tuna. That's a quote, bereft of tuna. The amended complaint said they were not 100% sustainably caught skipjack and yellowfin tuna. Got very specific there. But the U.S. District Judge in the case dismissed the second version, saying the plaintiffs did not show that they bought Subway tuna based on the alleged misrepresentations. So the judge said, I'm reading your complaint, and nowhere in the complaint do you say you relied upon these statements. And so if you're going to say that they are wrong for making the statements, you've got to show that you were harmed by it. The only way you'd be harmed by it is if you acted upon those statements and bought sandwiches that you thought contained tuna, but it turns out they didn't. Therefore, you've been harmed because you didn't get what you paid for. Okay? So the judge did not rule on the merits of the underlying case and said the plaintiffs could, if they wanted to, amend their complaint and refile it with amendments that solve the problem, explaining whether or not they relied upon the statements. So they now file a new complaint, and in it they rely on testing by a marine biologist. We don't know if his name is George Costanza, but a marine biologist of 20 tuna samples taken from 20 different Subway restaurants in Southern California. So they said that to prove our case, we went and got samples from 20 different restaurants, and they said 19 samples had no detectable tuna DNA sequences, and then all 20 contained detectable chicken, 11 contained detectable pork, and 7 contained cattle DNA. Now, the 19 samples containing no detectable DNA suggests that one of them did. And I've had several people say, Steve, isn't it probable that what we're talking about with the chicken and the pork and the cattle is cross-contamination. Because if you've ever been in a Subway, the restaurants are usually very small. They're actually very small. It's one of the reasons it's a successful franchise, is the franchise fees and the operations are fairly small compared to other big franchise restaurants. And so there's a very, very small space. And there might be places to eat, like tables, but the bulk of the restaurants are often nothing more than you walk in the door and there's a counter. And you walk up to one end of the counter and you talk to a person, and it's often the same person through the whole process, but sometimes it's 2 or 3 people, depending how busy they are. You talk to a person and you go, I want to buy a foot long on a white bread bun, and I want the chicken teriyaki with such and such cheese and blah, blah, blah. And then you walk along the row and you watch them, but also answer questions for them. Do you want this? Do you want that? Do you want pepper? Do you want this? And they build it for you, and they're sliding these materials down the counter. And then they get at the other end, and when they're done with it, if they may have put it in the oven for you and heated it up, toasted it. They may have sliced it in half for you. They then wrap it, stick it in a bag with some napkins, slide it over to the cashier, and the cashier rings you up and you pay. And then you walk away with your sandwich. And so it's possible to me to imagine quite easily that all of these ingredients are underneath the glass that you can look at. They're right there. And then the person is working on a work surface that's right there. And so this stuff is moving back and forth like this as the sandwich moves down the assembly line. And I have to imagine that it's quite possible that that is simply cross-contamination. That is, that as they're moving this stuff back and forth, the chicken that went into the sandwich right before you got your tuna, somehow there might be some chicken residue in there somewhere. I'm not saying it's right, but a lot of people I spoke to heard the headline and said, wait, the tuna sandwich contains no detectable DNA of tuna, but does contain chicken, pork, and cattle. It sounds like some kind of Frankenstein meat. And that would be if they were taking those and combining them to make some kind of faux tuna. But that's not the allegation here, I don't think. But that's what a lot of people were in their minds imagining when they heard no tuna, but it has pork, cattle, and chicken. Now, the author of the article, Jonathan Stemple, says that many people cannot eat various meats because of diet or religious issues. And that is a concern. So if you could not eat pork, for instance, but you can eat tuna, and you get a tuna sandwich that contains no detectable tuna, but it does contain detectable pork, that would be a concern, as you might imagine. The complaint said that testing shows that Subway mislabels its tuna products and it dupes consumers into paying premium prices. Now, one of the plaintiffs says that she ordered Subway tuna products more than 100 times between 2013 and 2019 and always checked the menu to ensure she'd be eating, quote, only tuna. So this complaint has been tailored to address the request of the judge. Show us how you relied on it. Show us how you were harmed. The lawsuit seeks unspecified damages for fraud and violations of California consumer protection laws. And the case is Amin et al. Versus Subway Restaurants, Inc. et al., U.S. District Court, Northern District of California, 21-00498. And that was originally filed earlier this year and has now been amended twice. And that, like I said, is quite common that the amendments happen. And so it simply raises the same issues we've discussed before, that if Subway prepares the tuna as they say they do, when you walk out the door with a sandwich, could you test the contents of the sandwich through DNA testing to confirm that it was, in fact, the tuna as described by Subway? I've seen people in the comments to all my videos on this who say both that, yes, they should be able to figure it out, and no, there's no way they can figure that out. And it has to do with what happens to the tuna meat between when it starts out in the ocean as a living, swimming being to when it winds up processed in your sandwich as you walk down the street with it. And obviously, it travels some distance to get where it goes, but it also gets processed. And I don't know what they do in the processing of it other than chopping it up and cooking it. But I've heard people say, yeah, but the cooking of it is the problem. And so I've said before that this is something that would be easy enough to show if you are Subway. And all you'd have to show is, here is the process by which we do this, and walk through it, and then show the verification of that. So you'd show the fact that you've got receipts for how much tuna you bought from people who sell tuna. And then you'd show that you have shipping receipts showing how much tuna you ship to each store. And then you'd show the paperwork showing that the stores received the tuna. And then you'd show, let's test what we have here and see what it does show when we test it. And there's got to be some way to test it to show that it does in fact contain what it started out with at the beginning of that supply chain. But whether that's DNA testing or not, I don't know. And I don't know enough about DNA testing to speculate. But I can tell you that in the comment section below, a lot of people will be speculating, and they'll be speculating that yes, it's completely doable, and no, it cannot be done. And so that, I don't know about that. The answer is going to come out in court, where I suspect somewhere down the road is going to be a trial, and both sides are going to bring in experts. And before the experts come in, though, I'm assuming that Subway's attorneys are going to say, look, we can show you all of this documentation that we buy all this tuna and we sell all these tuna sandwiches. And it just so happens that the tuna we buy equals the amount of tuna in those tuna sandwiches. And if there's a mismatch there might be a problem. But if they ain't making tuna sandwiches with the tuna, then what are they doing buying all that tuna? So, there might be something odd here simply in how this stuff is being tested. But again, I am not an expert in tuna DNA. And that is a sentence I never imagined I'd have to say. I hope I never have to say it again, but we'll see what happens. But Jonathan Stemple wrote the article for Reuters, and it was sent to me by Peter, Brian, Douglas, Chris, Don, Kevin, Paul, Mark, David and David, Brad, Edward, Doug, not Douglas, but Doug, also Douglas, T, the letter T, not Mr. T, not iced tea, just T, Sydney, Rick, and Michael. Thanks a lot, people. Questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. Live a meaningful life.